Sometimes it is not the illness that hurts the most. It is who does not show up when you are afraid you might not wake up again. I was 72 years old when a minor stroke put me in a hospital bed with an IV drip taped to my arm and a heart monitor beeping steadily beside me. It had happened on a Tuesday morning. I had been watering the hydrangeas on my front porch when the left side of my body suddenly went heavy and numb. The world tilted, the watering can slipped from my fingers, and I woke up looking at the fluorescent ceiling tiles of an emergency room. The doctors told me I was lucky. It was a transemic attack, a warning shot. My speech was slightly slurred, and my left hand felt stiff, but they assured me that with rest and physical therapy, I would recover. But as I lay in that narrow, sterile bed, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the machines, luck was not what I felt. I felt an overwhelming, crushing isolation. On the first day, I asked the nurses to call my son Julian. He was 42, a partner at a local finance firm, a man who liked to remind everyone how busy and important he was. The call went to voicemail. I asked them to call my daughter Paige. She lived 20 minutes away in a sprawling suburban house with her husband and 2 teenagers. Her phone also went straight to voicemail. By the second day, the silence in my room had become deafening. I lay awake, staring at the blank television screen, imagining the terrible reasons they hadn't come. Perhaps there had been an accident. Perhaps they were in a different hospital. The panic gnawed at the edges of my drug-addled mind. On the third day, the morning nurse, a kind, exhausted woman named Sarah, came in to check my vitals. She saw me staring at the empty visitor's chair in the corner of the room. "Mrs. Harrow," Sarah said gently, adjusting the blood pressure cuff on my arm. "I tried the emergency contacts again this morning. Both numbers went straight to voicemail." She hesitated, looking down at my chart, her eyes filled with a soft, unbearable pity. "Is it possible they are out of the country? When I called your daughter's number, the automated voicemail message said she was traveling and wouldn't be checking messages until the 28th. Traveling." The word hit me like a physical blow. My son and my daughter were in Europe. I remembered Paige mentioning a few weeks ago that Julian's wife, Monica, had been looking at flights to Paris for a couple's getaway. They had asked me if they could borrow some funds from the family trust to cover the airfare. I had told them I would think about it. I didn't need to think about it anymore. They had gone. They were taking pictures under the Eiffel Tower, eating in expensive restaurants, and shopping in boutiques, while I was lying alone under fluorescent hospital lights, wondering if I would ever walk normally again. "I see," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and hollow. "Thank you, Sarah. I spent 2 more days in that hospital." I did not ask the nurses to call them again. I did my physical therapy. I squeezed the rubber ball to get the feeling back in my left hand. I practiced walking down the tiled hallway with a cane. I did not cry. I simply focused on the mechanics of survival. On the morning of the 6th day, the doctor signed my discharge papers. "Do you have someone to drive you home, Mrs. Harrow?" he asked, looking at my chart. "We prefer patients don't take a taxi alone after a neurological event." "My family is unavailable," I said smoothly, buttoning my coat with my clumsy fingers. "A taxi will be fine." The ride home took 30 minutes. I sat in the back of the cab, watching the familiar suburban streets roll by. For the last 40 years, my life had been defined by those streets. This was where my late husband, Edmund, and I had bought our first house. This was where we had raised Julian and Paige. This was where I had stayed awake through midnight fevers, cooked thousands of dinners, and kept the family standing tall after Edmund passed away 10 years ago. The taxi turned onto my street and pulled into my driveway. I paid the driver, tipped him well, and stepped out into the humid afternoon air. I looked at the house. Harrow House. The grass in the front yard was overgrown, reaching up past the edges of the sidewalk. The mailbox at the end of the driveway was stuffed so full that the metal door was hanging open, magazines and envelopes spilling onto the damp concrete. On the porch, a stack of newspapers was slowly yellowing in the sun. It was the house of a woman who had been forgotten. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was stale, smelling faintly of dust and old coffee. I walked into the kitchen. There were dirty dishes piled in the sink, coffee mugs and plates that Julian and Paige had left there the morning I was taken to the hospital. They had stopped by to drop off some paperwork they wanted me to sign for the trust, drank my coffee, and left. 2 hours later, I had collapsed on the porch. I set my purse down on the kitchen island. Sitting right next to it, probably buried under a stack of junk mail that Paige had haphazardly tossed onto the counter before she left, was a thick envelope from my primary credit card company. The seal was already broken. I pulled the statement out and unfolded it. I am an old woman, but my mind has always been sharp when it comes to numbers. Edmund and I had built a comfortable life, and I managed every penny of it carefully. Julian and Paige had always treated my accounts as an extension of their own, assuming that because I loved them, I wouldn't mind if they borrowed the card for an emergency. But as I scanned the charges on the statement, my blood ran cold. June 12th, 940,000. Hotel Le Maurice, Paris. I was in the emergency room, having an MRI scan to determine if the clot in my brain was expanding. June 15th, 320,000. L'Avenue Restaurant, Paris. I was lying in the hospital bed, listening to the doctor tell me that my recovery might not be simple and that I might need in-home care. June 18th, 1,250,000. Air France flight upgrade. I was sitting in a wheelchair in the physical therapy wing, waiting for a daughter who was never going to come. Every single date lined up perfectly. Every charge was a timestamp of their joy, overlapping precisely with my terror. They hadn't just abandoned me. They had used my money to fund their escape. I stood in the silent kitchen, holding the paper that proved my children viewed me not as a mother, but as a wallet, a safety net that required no maintenance, an inheritance they were just waiting to claim. In the past, I would have cried. I would have called them, yelled at them, demanded an explanation, and eventually, inevitably, forgiven them. Because that is what mothers do. We forgive. We absorb the pain so our children don't have to feel the guilt. But the woman who would have done that died in a hospital bed on June 12th. I set the statement down on the counter. I looked around the kitchen at the oak cabinets Edmund had installed, at the height chart carved into the doorframe where Julian and Paige had grown up. If they can leave you behind, a quiet voice whispered in my mind, you can leave them too. I walked to the kitchen phone, picked up the receiver, and dialed a number I found in the yellow pages. Briggs Locksmith, a gruff voice answered. Hello, I said, my voice steady and clear. My name is Vivian Harrow. I need every external lock on my house changed immediately. Can you send someone this afternoon? I can have a guy there in an hour, ma'am, he replied. Thank you, I said. I hung up the phone. That was the moment I stopped being the mother who waited by the door. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom. I opened the heavy wooden dresser and pulled out a small locked metal box. Inside were the titles to the house and the 2 cars in the garage, the paperwork for the family trust, and a copy of my last will and testament. Julian had always hated my car. It was a sturdy 10-year-old sedan that Edmund had bought for me. Julian called it a dinosaur and constantly pressured me to sell it and buy something newer, something more befitting the mother of a successful finance partner. He had even offered to take it off my hands to sell for parts, clearly intending to pocket whatever small amount he could get for it. I picked up the car keys. I drove to a local dealership on the other side of town. The manager looked at me skeptically, an old woman walking slightly with a cane. But the car was in pristine condition, and I had the title in hand. I sold the car that afternoon for $6,000. I didn't deposit the check into the joint checking account that Julian had access to for emergencies. Instead, I walked into a different bank entirely, one where they didn't know my name, and opened a private independent account. I deposited the money. When I returned home in a taxi, Noah Briggs, the locksmith, was just finishing up the front door. "All done, Mrs. Harrow," he said, handing me a heavy envelope filled with shiny new keys. "Front, back, and garage doors. The old keys won't even turn the cylinder." "Thank you, Noah," I said, handing him the cash. I stood on the front porch, holding the heavy envelope. I looked at the new brass lock gleaming in the late afternoon sun. It was a small piece of metal, but it was the heaviest boundary I had ever set in my life. Julian and Paige had carried copies of my house key on their keychains since they were teenagers. It was a symbol of their absolute unearned access to my life, my home, and my resources. And now they were locked out. I walked inside and locked the door behind me. I went back to the kitchen, took a blank legal pad, and sat down at the table. I placed the credit card statement on the left. I placed a copy of my hospital discharge papers on the right. I began to write. I created a ledger. On one side, I wrote the date, the location, and the amount of money my children had spent in Europe. On the other side, I wrote exactly what medical procedure I was enduring at that precise moment. It wasn't a ledger of finances. It was a ledger of betrayal. And as I wrote, the last lingering shreds of my guilt vanished. They thought they had left an old woman behind to quietly fade away so they could inherit her life. They had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I walked through Harrow House not as its owner, but as a ghost observing a museum of my own making. I traced my fingers over the polished surface of the heavy mahogany dining table. Paige had explicitly asked me to leave this table to her in my will, claiming she wanted to host Thanksgiving dinners for her children on it. But last Thanksgiving, she had taken her family to a ski resort instead, leaving me sitting alone at this very table with a store-bought rotisserie chicken. I looked at the expensive leather armchair in the corner of the study. Julian had claimed it as his reading chair whenever he visited, though he usually just sat in it to complain about his colleagues while I poured his coffee. At noon, the doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Althea Bell, my next-door neighbor of 20 years. She was a sweet, observant widow who spent most of her time tending to her rose bushes. She stood on the porch, holding a tin foil-covered pie. "Vivian, dear, I heard you were back," she said, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "I brought you a peach cobbler. How are you feeling?" "I am recovering, Althea." "Thank you," I said, taking the warm pie. She lingered on the porch, looking slightly uncomfortable. Vivian, I don't mean to pry, but I saw the ambulance take you away on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday morning, I saw Julian and Paige loading massive suitcases into an airport shuttle. I assumed they were going to a specialist hospital to be near you. But then the shuttle had luggage tags for international departure. I looked at the peach cobbler in my hands. The heavy, undeniable truth settled over me like a thick blanket. It hadn't been a misunderstanding. It hadn't been a pre-booked trip they couldn't cancel. They had literally watched me get carried away in an ambulance. And the very next morning, they had packed their bags for Paris. Yes, I said quietly, looking Althea in the eye. They went to Europe. Althea's expression shifted from confusion to a deep, quiet horror. Oh, Vivian, I am so sorry. Don't be, I replied, and to my own surprise, I meant it. It has been very illuminating. That night, I slept in the master bedroom, on the side of the bed I had shared with Edmund for 40 years. I looked at the empty space beside me. It ends here, Edmund, I whispered to the dark room. I am done waiting. The next week was a whirlwind of quiet, ruthless efficiency. I called a local real estate agency and asked for their most aggressive agent. Camille Porter arrived 2 hours later in a sharp suit and sensible heels. She walked through the 4-bedroom suburban house, taking rapid notes on her tablet. It's a beautiful property, Mrs. Harrow, Camille said. The market is incredibly hot right now for family homes in this school district. If you want a quick close, I have 3 buyers who would waive the inspection and pay cash. List it, I said, and sell it fast. While Camille handled the paperwork, I began the process of dismantling the life my children thought they owned. I called an estate liquidation company. I didn't sort through the furniture trying to figure out what Paige or Julian might want. I didn't care. I watched indifferent men in work boots carry out the mahogany dining table, the leather reading chair, the antique china cabinet, and the massive television Julian had bought with my credit card 3 years ago. Every piece of furniture that left the house felt like a heavy stone being lifted from my chest. I kept only what truly mattered. I packed Edmund's silver pocket watch. I packed a patchwork quilt my grandmother had made. I packed a small box of photographs, mostly of Edmund and me, before the children were born, back when our love was just ours. Everything else was sold. With the house practically empty, I took a taxi downtown to the law offices of Gideon Price. Gideon was a sharp, meticulous estate attorney who had handled Edmund's probate 10 years ago. He sat behind his massive oak desk, reviewing the documents I had brought him. Vivian, Gideon said, peering at me over his reading glasses, you are requesting a complete overhaul of your estate. You are removing Julian Harrow and Paige Whitcomb as the primary beneficiaries of your liquid assets, your property, and your life insurance policies. That is correct, I said. If you leave them entirely out of the will, they will almost certainly contest it in probate court, claiming you were not of sound mind following your stroke, Gideon warned gently. Then leave them exactly $1 each, I said smoothly. Write a clause explicitly stating that the dollar is given in full satisfaction of any and all claims against my estate, and that they are intentionally excluded from any further inheritance due to their prolonged emotional and physical abandonment. Gideon's eyebrows rose slightly, but a faint smile played on his lips. Very well. And the remainder of the estate? I want it placed into a perpetual trust, I instructed. We will call it the Vivian Harrow Kindness Scholarship. It will provide full university tuition for students emerging from the foster care system. I want my money to go to children who actually know what it means to be abandoned, so they can build a life they won't take for granted. Gideon nodded, his pen scratching rapidly across his legal pad. It's an ironclad structure, Vivian. They won't be able to touch a single penny. Good. Before I left the city, I stopped at a real estate management office. I didn't want to buy another sprawling house. I didn't want a yard to maintain or empty bedrooms to dust. I signed a 2-year lease on a small, fully furnished cottage located in a sleepy coastal town 3 hours away. It was called Rosewick Cottage. It had a small kitchen, a stone fireplace, and a wooden deck that looked directly out over the gray, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean. When I returned to Harrow House for the final time, the rooms echoed with emptiness. The cash from the estate sale was safely deposited in my new private bank account. The house had officially closed that morning to a young couple relocating from out of state. I walked into the kitchen. The only things remaining on the counter were my purse, a large photo album, and a thick white envelope. I opened the photo album to the very first page. It was a picture of Julian and Paige as toddlers, smiling brightly in front of a Christmas tree. I took the ledger I had written, the meticulous list of their Parisian credit card charges, lined up against my hospital treatments, and taped it firmly over the photograph. Then I took a pen and wrote a letter. Julian and Paige, by the time you read this, you will have realized that your keys no longer work. You will have realized that the house you grew up in no longer belongs to our family. While you were sipping champagne in Paris, I was lying in a hospital bed alone, wondering if the left side of my body would ever work again. While you were upgrading your flights, I was listening to doctors tell me I might not survive the next clot. You did not just abandon me. You used my money to fund your escape from the inconvenience of my mortality. I spent 72 years being your mother. I cooked, I cleaned, I paid your bills, and I waited for you to love me back. I am done waiting. The house is sold. The car is gone. My will has been changed. You are no longer my beneficiaries. I hope the memories you made in Europe were worth the cost. 'Cause they cost you everything. Do not look for me. Vivian and I folded the letter, placed it inside the thick white envelope, and sealed it. I walked out the front door, locked the new brass deadbolt, and taped the envelope directly over the peephole. I walked down the driveway and got into the taxi waiting at the curb. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked. "Rosewick Cottage," I said, looking out the window as the house faded into the distance. "Take the coastal highway." The return flight from Paris landed at 3 o'clock on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. If I had still been waiting by the door, I would have known this because I would have been tracking their flight online, making sure they arrived safely. Instead, I only knew it because 3 hours later, while I was sitting on the wooden deck of Rosewick Cottage, drinking a cup of Earl Grey tea, my new private cell phone began to vibrate violently on the table. I didn't answer it. I let it ring. In the suburbs, 200 miles away, 2 large airport taxis pulled into the driveway of Harrow House. Julian stepped out of the first taxi, wearing expensive designer sunglasses and a crisp linen shirt. Monica followed, holding a large shopping bag from a boutique on the Champs-Élysées. Paige and her husband, Reed, emerged from the second taxi, looking tanned, rested, and deeply satisfied with their luxury vacation. Julian grabbed his heavy leather suitcase from the trunk. I'll go unlock the front door so we can drag these in before we check on Mom, he told Paige. He walked up the familiar concrete path, stepping past the slightly overgrown rose bushes. He reached the front door, pulled his heavy keychain from his pocket, and slid the brass key into the lock. Julian frowned. He jiggled the key, pulling it out slightly and shoving it back in. It hit the back of the cylinder with a dull click, entirely incompatible with the tumblers inside. What's wrong? Paige asked, hauling her own suitcase up the steps. The lock is jammed, Julian muttered, twisting the key harder. Or maybe Mom had the old lock replaced. She's been paranoid lately. Let me try yours. Paige handed him her key. He slid it in. It didn't turn. This is ridiculous, Monica sighed, fanning herself in the afternoon heat. Just ring the doorbell. She has to be home. She never goes anywhere. Julian pressed the doorbell. The familiar chime echoed faintly from deep within the house. They waited 10 seconds, 30 seconds, a full minute. Mom, Julian shouted, banging the flat of his hand against the heavy wooden door. Mom, open up! It's us! There was no answer. Julian stepped off the porch and walked over to the large bay window that looked into the living room. He cupped his hands around his eyes to block the glare of the sun and pressed his face against the glass. He froze. Julian? Paige asked, her voice faltering as she saw the color drain completely from her brother's tanned face. Julian, what is it? Did she fall? Is she on the floor? Julian didn't answer. He just stood there, staring through the glass. Paige rushed over and pressed her face against the window next to him. The living room was completely empty. The sofa was gone. The television was gone. The antique rugs, the bookshelves, the lamps. Everything was gone. The room was nothing but bare hardwood floors and faint rectangular outlines on the walls where paintings had hung for 30 years. What the hell? Julian whispered, stepping back from the window. He ran around the side of the house and peered through the kitchen window. The mahogany dining table was missing. The countertops were completely bare. Even the microwave was gone. We've been robbed, Monica gasped, dropping her designer shopping bag onto the grass. Oh my God, someone cleared out the house while we were gone. Where is Mom? Paige cried, panic finally bleeding into her voice. If someone broke in, where is she? Yoo-hoo! They all whipped around. Standing on the sidewalk, holding a pair of gardening shears, was Mrs. Althea Bell. She was smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Julian Paige. Welcome back, Mrs. Bell called out pleasantly. Mrs. Bell. Julian rushed toward her. What happened here? Our house has been completely cleared out. Have you seen my mother? Did you call the police? Mrs. Bell looked at him, her expression hardening into a look of profound, icy judgment. The police? Mrs. Bell asked softly. Why on earth would I call the police? Vivian moved out 3 weeks ago. Julian stared at her as if she had spoken in Greek. Moved out? What do you mean, moved out? She can't move out. This is her house. Actually, Mrs. Bell corrected him, pointing a gloved finger at the discreet wooden sign staked into the front lawn, mostly obscured by the overgrown bushes. It belongs to the Henderson family now, a lovely young couple. They closed on the property last Friday. Paige grabbed her husband's arm, her knees suddenly weak. Sold? She sold the house without telling us? She had a lot of free time to make arrangements, Mrs. Bell said, her voice dripping with venom. Considering she spent nearly a week alone in the hospital, recovering from a stroke while you were sipping wine in France. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have roses to prune. Mrs. Bell turned her back on them and walked away. Julian stood on the sidewalk, his mind frantically trying to process the impossibility of what was happening. The house, the massive, fully paid off asset he had mentally calculated into his own retirement plan for years, was gone. Call her, Julian ordered, turning to Paige. Call her right now. Paige pulled out her phone and dialed the familiar number. It rang 4 times and went to an automated message stating the number had been disconnected. It's disconnected, Paige shrieked, tears springing to her eyes. Julian, her phone is turned off. Try her email. Try her bank. Try anything, Julian yelled, pulling out his own phone and scrolling frantically through his banking app. He opened the joint checking account he shared with his mother, the account where her Social Security and pension checks were deposited, the account he used to pay off his own credit cards when things got tight. The balance was 0. The account had been formally closed. She took the money, Julian whispered, the true scale of the disaster finally hitting him. She closed the accounts. She sold the house. Look, Reed said suddenly, pointing at the front door. Taped directly over the peephole, blending in with the white paint of the door, was a thick envelope. Julian ran up the steps, tore the envelope off the door, and ripped it open. Inside was the heavy photo album page and the handwritten letter. He read it. He read the ledger of his credit card charges lined up against her hospital dates. He read the words, I am done waiting. He read the sentence, you are no longer my beneficiaries. Julian's hands began to shake. The piece of paper fluttered in the afternoon breeze. What does it say? Paige demanded, running up the steps and snatching the letter from his hands. She read it, and a loud, broken sob tore from her throat. She crumpled onto the porch steps, burying her face in her hands. Monica looked at Julian, her eyes wide with terror. Julian, the country club dues, the private school tuition for the kids. If she cut off the trust, how are we going to pay for everything? Julian didn't answer. He looked at the empty house, the locked door, and the useless keys in his hand. The safety net he had spent 42 years taking for granted had simply vanished into thin air. He pulled out his phone again. He didn't call the disconnected number. He opened his web browser and searched for Gideon Price, the family estate lawyer. He dialed the office number. Gideon Price's office. A receptionist answered. This is Vivian Harrow, Julian demanded, his voice thick with panic and rage. I need to speak to Gideon right now. My mother is missing. She sold our family home, and I need to file an injunction to freeze her assets before she loses her mind. I'm sorry, Mr. Harrow, the receptionist said politely. Mr. Price is currently in a meeting, but he left a message for you should you call. What is the message? Julian snapped. He instructed me to tell you that Mrs. Harrow is of entirely sound mind, that all asset transfers have been legally finalized, and that any attempt to contest the Edmund Harrow Kindness Scholarship will be met with aggressive litigation. The receptionist paused. He also mentioned that Mrs. Harrow requested you stop calling. Have a good day, sir. The line went dead. Julian slowly lowered the phone. Where is she? Paige cried from the porch steps, clutching the letter to her chest. Julian, where is our mother? Julian looked at his sister. For the first time in his life, he had no answers, no control, and no access. She's gone, Paige, Julian whispered. She's gone. It took them 3 weeks to find me. I knew they eventually would. Even without my old phone number or my address, Julian was resourceful. when his finances were threatened. He likely hired a private investigator to track the license plate of the taxi I had taken, or bribed a clerk at the local utility company to find out where my name had popped up on a new electric bill. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in a rocking chair on the wooden deck of Rosewick Cottage, wrapped in a thick wool shawl. A cool, salty breeze was blowing off the Atlantic, carrying the scent of seaweed and rain. I was reading a mystery novel and drinking a cup of peppermint tea. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway broke the rhythm of the waves. I didn't turn around immediately. I took a slow sip of my tea, marked my page with a folded receipt, and set the book down on the small table beside me. A heavy car door slammed shut, then another. Footsteps pounded up the wooden stairs leading to the deck. Mom! I turned my head. Julian and Paige were standing at the top of the stairs. They looked terrible. The glowing tans they had brought back from Paris had faded into a sickly, exhausted pallor. Julian had dark circles under his eyes, his designer shirt wrinkled and untucked. Paige looked as though she had been crying for days, her hair pulled back into a messy knot. I looked at them, and to my profound surprise, my heart did not race. I didn't feel the familiar, instinctual urge to rush forward, comfort them, and ask what was wrong. I just felt tired. Hello, Julian. Hello, Paige, I said calmly, remaining seated in my rocking chair. Julian marched across the wooden deck, his fists clenched at his sides. Are you insane? He yelled, his voice echoing over the sound of the ocean. Do you have any idea what you've done? I had to hire a private investigator just to find out if you were alive. You sold our house. You stole the trust money. I looked at him, my expression completely flat. If you raise your voice to me again, Julian, you will leave, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a steel edge that stopped him in his tracks. I will not be yelled at in my own home. Your home? Julian scoffed, throwing his hands in the air. You sold our home. You sold Harrow House without even consulting us. Do you know how much that property was worth? Do you know what you've done to our financial planning? It was never your home, Julian, I corrected him quietly. It was my home. Edmund and I bought it. We paid the mortgage. We paid the property taxes. It belonged to me. And I decided I no longer wished to live in a museum dedicated to people who do not love me. Paige stepped forward, tears spilling down her cheeks. She dropped to her knees beside my rocking chair and tried to grab my hand. I pulled my hand back and tucked it under my shawl. Mom, please, Paige sobbed. I'm so sorry. I know we should have been there when you were in the hospital. I know it was selfish to go to Paris, but we thought you were fine. The doctor said it was just a minor stroke. I was fine, I agreed softly. The stroke didn't kill me. The realization that my children would rather drink champagne in Europe than hold my hand in an emergency room, that is what killed me. We are your children, Julian shouted, stepping forward again, the desperation leaking through his anger. You can't just cut us off. I have private school tuition to pay. Monica's credit cards are maxed out. We relied on that trust. Mom, we relied on the inheritance. You relied on my death, I said bluntly. Julian flinched as if I had slapped him. You didn't look at me and see a mother, I continued, looking directly into his eyes. You looked at me and saw a bank account with a heartbeat. You calculated your future based on my absence. So I gave you my absence. Early a mom. You can't do this. Paige wept, burying her face in her hands. You can't give everything to a scholarship fund. We are your blood. You can't leave us with nothing. I am not leaving you with nothing. I am leaving you with exactly what you earned. I spent 72 years waiting for birthday calls that came 3 days late. I spent decades cooking holiday dinners that you left early because you had better plans. I spent a week in a hospital bed waiting for a single phone call from my children. I leaned forward in the rocking chair. You are not allowed to play the part of grieving, devastated children. You never bothered to play the part of loving ones, I told them. The money is gone. The house is gone. The will is legally sealed. I have nothing left for you to take. Julian stared at me, his chest heaving. The realization that his intimidation tactics were completely useless against a woman who no longer feared losing him finally sank in. You're crazy, Julian whispered, shaking his head. You're actually crazy. No, Julian, I said, picking up my teacup. For the first time in my life, I am completely sane. Now, get off my porch. They didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue about. They had come looking for a safety net, and they had found concrete. Julian turned and walked down the stairs, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Paige lingered for a moment, looking at me with desperate, pleading eyes, hoping for a crack in my armor, a sign of the mother who used to forgive everything. I took a sip of my peppermint tea and looked out at the ocean. Paige turned and followed her brother to the car. I didn't watch them drive away. I listened to the sound of the engine fading into the distance, replaced once again by the rhythmic, endless crashing of the waves against the shore. The first winter at Rosewick Cottage was cold, but it was a clean, beautiful kind of cold. The phone calls from Julian and Paige eventually stopped. The angry voicemails faded into silence. They realized that the scholarship trust was impenetrable and that the mother they had taken for granted was truly, permanently gone from their lives. I learned to live in the quiet. At first, the silence ached. It is a terrifying thing to extract yourself from the center of a family you built, even a toxic one. There were nights when I looked at the old photographs of Edmund and cried for the family we thought we had created. But gradually, the ache began to recede, replaced by something I had never experienced before. Absolute peace. I didn't have to wait for the phone to ring. I didn't have to worry about Julian's credit card debt or Paige's passive-aggressive complaints. I just had to wake up, make my tea, and watch the tide roll in. I made friends in the coastal town, real friends. There was a young couple next door, Sarah and Mark, who had a wild, energetic 5-year-old boy named Leo. When winter turned into spring, I started baking oatmeal cookies and leaving them on their porch. In return, Leo started bringing me handfuls of seashells he found on the beach, presenting them to me as if they were diamonds. One afternoon in late May, I was sitting on my deck when Sarah knocked on the wooden railing. She was holding a plate of warm blueberry muffins. "Hi, Vivian," Sarah smiled, holding out the plate. "Leo wanted to make sure you got these while they were still warm. We were wondering if you'd like to come over for dinner tonight. We're grilling fish, and we'd love the company." I looked at the warm muffins. I looked at the young mother who didn't want my money, didn't want my house, and didn't expect anything from me other than my company. "I would love that, Sarah." I smiled. That evening, I sat in my small bedroom and opened a leather-bound journal I had bought when I first moved to the cottage. I picked up a pen and wrote the date. "I used to think that family was defined by blood. T, I wrote. But blood without love is just a shared last name. True family is found in the people who show up when the room is dark, It is found in the people who bring you muffins just because they thought of you. I looked out the window at the moon, reflecting off the dark ocean. I spent 72 years waiting for love to come back the way I gave it. I wrote at the bottom of the page. Now, I have stopped waiting. I am finally free. If call, thank you for listening to my story. If this story gave you something to think about, please leave a comment and subscribe so you don't miss the stories to come.